The new kid on the block is offshore wind, and you'll see just how new in the next slide. Just like I showed you where the wind capacity is the greatest onshore, here's what it looks like offshore. Green is not good. This lovely light magenta is not bad, not great. This orange you can see is much better, and the deeper purple, I don't know if you want to call it deeper purple, is not bad. Notice that the Great Lakes themselves have pretty good wind capability as well. In terms of how much wind do we have? Well, according to this chart, we have a whopping sum total of 42 megawatts of capacity offshore. So what would that equate to? If we're looking at that proverbial 2 megawatt Gamesa onshore wind turbine, that would be what? 21 of them. So basically we have nothing currently operating off wind, but you can see offshore, you can see that there is a lot of interest in this. New York, huge. Massachusetts, New Jersey, North Carolina. Notice nothing on the West Coast, and I'll explain why in a later slide. Relatively speaking, the U.S. is late to this party. You can see the U.K. has been the world leader with the construction of offshore wind. And then who is the newest Johnny on the spot? It is none other than China, making an aggressive bid with offshore wind. But keep in mind, these are still relatively small. If you talk like 8,000 megawatts, again, that would be like what, 4,000 turbines in the water. So these numbers are not terribly large. But you can see a lot is ongoing. This chart shows you a couple of important things. Notice that the deeper the blue, the deeper the water. That's key because the further out you get from shore, the more expensive it is. The deeper the water that you have the project in currently, the more expensive it is. So notice that all of these projects kind of hug the East Coast. Where you see these orange call areas, the person that handles the leasing, or the entity that handles the leasing, is the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, I think is what it stands for, BOEM. It's the federal government. The federal government controls everything outside of 3 miles of shore. And so these call areas are where the BOEM has said, hey, we're interested in looking into them. Hey, would any of you companies be interested in talking to us about them? But you see the problem with the West Coast is, notice how deep the water gets very quickly. So that's going to make it more expensive to construct wind turbines offshore. So right now, the East Coast is where it's at, with this area having the most interest and attention. All right, so let's stop talking about, oh wait, there's one other key thing I wanted to bring out. I think that offshore wind has the possibility to be a game changer. Why? Because the wind resources are where the populations are. We talked about how onshore wind is well cited to be in flyover country. Well, there's a tremendous amount of the American population that lives here, and suddenly the challenges of transporting the electricity to these entities is much less. Now, here I don't see offshore wind being a big player until they come up with better floating technology where it doesn't have to connect to the ocean floor, and the prices come down on that. Also, I missed it on an earlier chart. One thing that's cool about offshore wind is it tends to be the strongest in the afternoon and the evenings, which, as we know, is when electricity use tends to be at its peak, which is different than onshore wind. So it makes it a little bit better suited to the timeline when people actually use electricity. Okay, so let's go on. I thought this was an interesting slide because it talks about what does it take. And so from the time that a company identifies a possible site, it can be a long time before they actually begin to make it happen. They spend a lot of time getting the rights for the land, knowing that they've got a good place, and then permitting and interconnection process. This is how they make sure that they will be allowed to tie into the grid, and that is a big deal. And I think we're going to hear more about that from some of our guest lecturers. This step, I had you read about power production agreements. PPAs are essential in the process because it is a tremendous amount of money upfront to construct this wind farm, or the same is true for a solar farm. And before investors are going to sign up to that, they're going to want to see that you have a guaranteed buyer of your electricity. This is not a build it and they will come type of affair. People want to know that you have your economics locked down before they're willing to finance you. Then you actually go into buying them. The construction actually is pretty quick. And then you see project operation. It goes in and it lasts a long, long time. I had you read a couple of articles about power production agreements. They are critical. Remember the difference between a physical and a virtual. A physical is when you're actually agreeing to buy the electricity. That actually is not as common as the virtual, because in a lot of cases the purchasers of the electricity aren't near where the electricity is going to be generated. And this is where people are doing the showing how green they are. This is where, when you see that Google has gone out and bought X number or X percent of its electricity requirements, probably what they've done is they bought into a wind or solar project, which where are the majority of them being generated? In Texas, in the United States. But we all know that their facilities aren't located predominantly in Texas. So they're buying enough green power in theory to power their plants and their operations. In practice, they're buying whatever it is that their local provider is offering to them. The PPAs do vary with the local electricity prices because you are competing. Wherever you build your wind or solar farm, you are competing with other generation capability. You can see the trend in PPAs, and the way you could figure this out is just the 40 per megawatt hour would mean 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Because again, I think of in Texas, we pay residential about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. You can see the trend in PPA pricing has been going down. So as this becomes more mature, people are willing to pay less of a price to lock in for the long term. But particularly with the tax credits and the like, even this relatively low sum of money becomes enough to make it very attractive to investors. So the power purchase agreement is a key part in getting renewable projects off the ground, because it tells everyone we do have a way to sell our electricity. And this is kind of an ugly slide, but I couldn't get it cut down. So I hope that in class we're going to be able to present better cost data. I've been on the prowl for quite some time to find really good cost data, and I haven't found the holy grail just yet, but I'm hopeful that we're going to lock in some guest speakers that will be able to share with us more. Here's some rules of thumb that I've heard about constructing constructing a wind farm. About $10,000 paid to the landowner up front to lease the turbine, to lease the space. Then the cost of the turbines themselves end up being, like for that 2 megawatt Gamesa system, probably looking at about $3 million for the wind turbine and the blades. Construction, $200,000 worth of concrete that you put into the ground. As you would imagine, those cranes are expensive, so you have to rent them. And then you have to build the electrical infrastructure to tie in your wind turbines into the existing grid. And so I saw one rule of thumb that said it's about $80,000 per mile if you have to build lines to connect your wind farm into the existing grid infrastructure. So a rule of thumb that I've heard is about $1.5 million per megawatt to construct the wind farm. So let's make that easy. Let's take that 2 megawatt wind turbine. So 2 megawatt wind turbine means about $3 million to build that wind turbine. And so if we have 100 wind turbines in the wind farm, then we're looking at a $300 million project. So you can see why it is so important to line up really good financing and really good investors ahead of time, because we are talking about a huge chunk of change. Ongoing costs, I've heard a rule of thumb that the average, just assume about $10,000 per turbine per year. Maintenance, insurance, administration, you can see all of these things add up, but it's generating a good amount of electricity per year now, isn't it? And so then again, you see this rule of thumb that they produce about 40% of their rated capacity. In the next video, I'm going to share with you some of the latest information we have on what it costs and how this compares to some fossil fuel resources.